we really need to understand that the amount of money that's spent to control drugs, both in terms of the supply as well as the demand reduction side, is a fraction, literally a fraction of 1% of our gross domestic product.
The DEA's claim that spending, federal government spending, or even federal plus state and local spending on drug control is relatively small compared to the size of the government budget or the size of the economy, that's certainly correct. It's not totally trivial, but it's not going to change the deficit situation in a huge way. Their claim that it's small compared to the cost imposed by drug use or drug abuse is just unbelievably misleading, because most of the things people attribute as negatives from drug use, in fact, are the result of prohibition. So we're spending non-trivial amounts of money and making the situation worse, not spending those amounts of money and making the situation better.
It's still never more than $19.5 billion at its peak. That's never been more than that in the history of the United States. We're talking about $1 trillion health care bill right now. We're talking about $1 trillion a year in Iraq and Afghanistan. Or $1 trillion $1 trillion a year. That's what it is. So what are we talking about? That's the greatest source of the crime in America, the greatest disruption, the one that ruins more families than any other. I mean, you know, we've been talking about a war on crime forever. The best kind of battle against crime would be to provide treatment and prevention and education. Those should be increased in their focus so that you don't have the drug abuse that we have. Then you've got real dollars that are very effective and very minimal in terms of the national budget.
And if you think about the fact that over 20% of the men behind bars and 30% of the women are there for a drug law violation, if you figure that almost 2 million people are arrested for some drug-related offense, typically marijuana possession, if you think about the indirect costs of women being incarcerated and their children being thrown into a child welfare system, if you recognize the reality that many people going to prison actually had legal jobs when they were incarcerated, so you're losing that source of legal revenue and tax revenue. So there's no way to really cost it out, but my guess is you're approaching $100 billion a year.
If our critics on the other side of the issue, who are constantly saying that all of this has failed, if what they said was true and correct, then they would have won, and they should be happy and be cheering themselves for their victory, and should be telling us that, you know, we're obsolete and need to go away. But they're not. They're arguing that everything we're doing is failing, and yet they're arguing. So it tells me that they must be perceiving that what we're doing is working and what they're doing is not working, and that they need to drum up these myths like we're spending too much money or we're doing this or that. Whenever I'm asked about, you know, can we afford to spend this much money, I like repeating a line that William Bennett, the first drug czar back in the 1980s, used when he was asked that same question. He and I were at a function in New Hampshire when a reporter for the Manchester Union asked the director if indeed we were spending too much money, and was there at any point a level above which the United States would not go in terms of expenditures to control drugs. And Director Bennett thought about this question for a moment, and then he looked this reporter in the eye and he said, you know, there were people back in the 1860s who were advising President Lincoln that we could not afford to free the slaves because there would be economic chaos in the South. It would cause a tremendous disruption between the North and the South. It might even lead to war, and it would collapse the economy of the country. Well, we all know what the president did, and we all know that there was a tremendous cost. But would anyone today argue that what Lincoln did was wrong?
I think the opposition to changing policy and the reason that there isn't more recognition of all the negatives is because we don't have enough good examples of the counterfactual. We do have some. We know that when we legalized alcohol again after Prohibition, that the world didn't come to an end. We can observe other countries and see that have less punitive policies and see that the horrible predictions made by the drug warriors have not come true. But most people have now grown up in an era where all these drugs have been illegal. They don't have any experience or direct observation of a country that has legalized drugs, and so they get frightened by these excessive claims made by the drug warriors, and they're just a little nervous about taking what seems like a leap of faith into a different policy.
You know, one of the biggest obstacles to reform, and especially with respect to marijuana policy, is parents. It's parents, especially parents who used to smoke marijuana, came through it just fine. Maybe they smoke now, maybe they don't. Used to support making marijuana legal because they didn't want to get arrested or busted. And now their kids are in their teens, and these parents are opposing a change in marijuana policy. And when I ask them, these are some of my good friends, I say, what are you talking about? Why? And they say, well, I don't want my kid to do pot. And I said, did keeping it illegal keep you from doing it? They kind of look at me and go, no, I guess not. You know, and I said, do you realize that the odds of getting arrested now are twice what they were back then? And they go, well, really, you know? I said, why the hypocrisy? Why the hypocrisy around this? I mean, I know parents where the teenagers are smoking a joint with a wet towel behind, you know, sealing off the door, and the parents are smoking a joint with a wet towel by the door, and never the twain shall meet. I think it would be so much more healthy if we could talk about this honestly. I think if the relationship around marijuana between parents and their children could be more like the responsible relationships between parents and children around alcohol, we'd be a lot healthier society, and we'd stop this nonsense of arresting 800,000 Americans a year simply for possession of a joint.
The biggest obstacle to legalization is common sense. You dramatically increase the availability of drugs and all the crime and school dropouts and work dropouts that would be resulting from that. It is nonsense to say that parents are the obstacle. Parents who try to keep their kids off drugs, yeah, the legalizers don't like that because all the studies show that parents who talk to their kids actually stop their kids from using drugs. That's the most effective thing that you can do, is for parents to have a conversation and another one and another one and another one with their kids to establish a value of not using drugs. So the fact that parents learn from their mistakes and want to make sure their kids don't make them, that's commendable. That's not to be denigrated.